Welcome back. There's one final piece of the puzzle that we need with Redux, and something that we've been avoiding up until this point. You see, if we go to app.js, you remember that we do this component did mount fetch request. We have an asynchronous request. We're making a request to an API, grabbing their users, and then finally setting that state to robots. But how would that work in Redux? Because remember, up until this point, everything we've done has been synchronous. Because if we do the same thing like we did with the search field, it wouldn't work with fetching robots, because we're sending an action of, let's say, fetching robots, but because that's asynchronous, it's going to go off in another world into the API and try and get the robots. In the meantime, the reducer is just going to check the robots and say, there's no robots yet because in API land, that hasn't returned yet, just like a promise. So the reducer keeps going and doesn't make any changes because the state hasn't changed. So how can we create actions that are asynchronous that still go through the reducer, the store, and then make changes? And this is where we use apply middleware again. We can use something called Redux Thunk to handle asynchronous actions like AJAX calls. It's a middleware that provides a getState and dispatch function that are passed on. You're able to handle something called side effects like AJAX calls with this package. So we're going to show you how that works. First thing we want to do is install the package Redux Thunk. So I'm going to say npm install Redux Thunk. And by the way, just like with anything, there's tons of other ways to handle asynchronous action in Redux. It's just not built out of the gate, so you need some packages. There's other options, but Redux Thunk is the best and simplest to start off with. All right, we have Redux Thunk now, and we can simply start using it by going to index.js. And within here, we can say that we want to import something called Thunk middleware from Redux Thunk. Again, you can read all about this in their documentation on GitHub. Thunk middleware, we already know how to apply middleware to our Redux app, right? We have our apply middleware function. We can simply add the Thunk middleware. And let me just put this on a new line so you can see it better. Thunk middleware to our apply middleware. And this is ordered, so it's going to go through the Thunk middleware and then the logger middleware. Perfect. So let's run npm start. And I'm also going to save this. All right, looks like everything is running smoothly. We have this middleware implemented now, but how do we actually use it? Well, let's start with the very first steps. The first thing we want to do is create a constant. So a constant for requesting our robots. Remember, in the app.js file, we have this robots array that gets populated after a component did mount after we do the fetch call. And we set state with the new users. So in the constant, we can do something similar to above. We can export const request robots. Now, because this is going to be a promise, it's going to have 3 states. So the first one is going to be pending, which is the very first time that we send that request. It's going to be pending. We're waiting for the promise to return. So we'll, again, use the same string here. And we're also going to have two states after the pending returns, which is success and also failed. This request has three actions: pending, success, failed, that we want to keep track of. And again, this is pretty much standard with all asynchronous actions like AJAX calls. So let's save that. And the next step, as we know, is to create the actions using these things. So let's go back to actions. And this time, instead of just importing change search field, let's import a few more things. I'm going to import, let's just copy and paste here because that's a lot of typing. Let's go to constants. We're going to import pending, success, and then finally failed. Let's save. And we just get a warning that we're not using them. So let's create these actions now. Just like we did above, we're going to export const, and we'll name this request robots. And this action takes, what's it going to take? Well, this is a little tricky, but it's going to take the dispatch. And dispatch, if you remember, and we go to app.js, is something that we use in map dispatch to props that we get from Redux to dispatch the actions to the reducer. And when we come back here, you'll see that we're going to actually pass this to our action, so we have access to it. But again, for now, just know that we're going to have dispatch. And within here, we're going to do a few things that's a little bit different than the above. The very first thing, when we request robots, well, we want to dispatch the pending action. So again, we can just do the standard syntax of dispatching an object that is of type request robots pending. And the payload, well, there's no real payload. We just have a request pending. So we can just leave it the way it is right now without a payload. Next, we have something that is asynchronous. We need to do a fetch call. So we have our fetch function. And if you remember, we go to app.js. We have this API that we need to call. But we also need to do the response.json all over again. So I'm just going to copy all of that, go to actions, and just copy and paste this. So we're fetching the users. We're doing the .then and JSON, using the JSON method on the response. And then finally, in here, we have two options. We have the .then and .catch in case there's an error or something fails. In the .then, we receive some sort of data, which will be users. And once we've received that, we can say dispatch. We're going to dispatch. What do you think we're going to dispatch? Well, the object that is of type request robot success. And this time, the payload for this is going to be the data that we receive from the API. And with the catch, very similar, we'll get some sort of an error. And this error is going to, once again, dispatch. And it'll have a type of requests robots failed, with a payload of, let's give it the error that we receive. All right, let me make this a little smaller so you can see. So we save that, and now we have our actions. And this action is a lot more complicated than the set search field. We have a right away when we call this action, a dispatch that requests robots pending. And then we fetch the users, we receive the users, and then we either have a success with the payload of the users or an error with the payload of error. Finally, we go into the reducers. And in the reducer, we know that we want to import from the constants the same actions that we had. So let's just go to constants, or let's go to actions and copy exactly what we have here as well, because we're going to need all those constants. And now down here, we're going to create a new reducer, because instead of combining all these reducers, we want to make them each specific to their use case. This reducer worries about search robot. The new reducer is going to worry about the request robots. And once again, with the same syntax, we have state that's going to equal the initial state, and then the action that is going to have default empty object. And within here, an object, or within here, we'll have once again a switch statement that listens to action.type. And this action.type is going to have three possible states. One is that case is request robots pending, in which case we return object.assign, again, an empty object, the state, and then finally, we're going to create a new state called isPending. And this isPending is going to be set to true, because the request robots is pending currently. All right, the next thing we're going to do, again, we're going to have a case for this time the success, and this is going to return object.assign, an empty object, a state, and this new property, robots, that is action.payload. And also, we want to change the state isPending to now be false, because we've gotten the response from the promise. And then the third case is when there's an error. And in that case, we're going to return object.assign state, and we'll just have an error state that we'll create that has the action.payload. And once again, we're going to want to change the isPending to be equal to false, and close the object. And remember, always with a reducer, we want to have the very end always return the state if it doesn't match any of the criteria. So again, return state. Awesome. Now you might be thinking to yourself, initial state, we have this, but request robots doesn't care about search field. And in this case, we want to create two different initial states, one for the search robots and one for the request robots. So let's rename this to initial state search and create a new state, initial state robots, that now has these three states that we mentioned here. That is pending of false to start off with, a robots array that is currently empty, and an error string that is also empty. So let's save that. And let's see some errors that we get here. And we just have a little bit of a syntax error because we don't need this curly bracket. There you go. And again, we want to change the initial state robots in the function to this one. We save and everything looks good. Let me make this a little bit smaller. Now we have a problem. We have two reducers now. And if we go to index.js, we see that in the create store function, we're just using the search robots reducer. So let's import now the other reducer that we have, which is request robots, and now add this into the store as well. But how do we do that? Well, we have a function that, again, comes with Redux that's called combine reducers. And this combine reducers, pretty self-explanatory, combines all the reducers into a root reducer. So let's do that. I'm going to say const root reducer is going to equal the combine reducer, and this is going to accept in an object form, all the reducers. In my case, it's the search robots and request robots. And now this root reducer can be used in the store to include both reducers. Let's save. All right, we're almost there. Now, because we just used combine reducers, it's something that we've mentioned before. And that is, if I go into app.js and scroll all the way up to map state to props, our state now no longer has search field as part of its property. Instead, it's going to have two properties, search robots and request robots, which each have their own properties. So now we have to update the search robots like this, which has the property of search field. So this is what you're most likely going to see when you're working in Redux in map state to props. Perfect. Now, the final piece of the puzzle, Redux Thunk. How does this work? Well, Redux Thunk is a middleware that waits and sees if any actions return a function instead of an object. What does that mean? If we go to actions, we see that this is returning an object. But right here, we're not returning an object, are we? As a matter of fact, we're not really returning anything right now. Thunk middleware is waiting for a function. And if ever an action that goes through it, remember, a middleware is just a tunnel that actions go through, and it notices a function, it's going to act upon it. So let's do that first, and I'll explain in details how it works. We first need to go to app.js, and within here, we want to update a few things. First, we want to update the state to now also include the robots, to have state.request robots.robots. Again, this is the state from the reducer. There's also the is pending state, again, through the request robots.is pending. And then finally, the error state from, once again, state request robots error. The second part, and the most important part, is the request robot action. Again, something that replaces this component did mount request. The way we can do that is within here, add another property that we're going to pass on, and we can name it whatever we want. We'll say on request robots. And this is going to be a function. And this function, remember, we don't want to necessarily just dispatch. We want to return a function from it. In our case, it's the request robots reducer. And this request robots reducer or action has the dispatch method. All right, I know that's a lot, so let's just go through this one more time. Right now, we need the request robots action. And this request robots action needs a dispatch method to actually dispatch these actions. So in app.js, we first need to import our action, which is request robots from the actions file. And this request robots needs to have the dispatch method. This is the same as doing this. And now, this dispatch is going to work as long as we use Redux Thunk, because it's going to catch the fact that this is going to return a function. So if we go back to our actions, we can now do this. All right. What just happened? Well, we've created a higher order function, a function that returns a function. And I know this can get a little bit confusing, but a thunk, because now request robots is going to return, again, because of error functions, this is going to imply that it's returning this. It's going to provide the dispatch function to this second layer function so that we can use it here. Again, this is something that you just have to get used to, but in the end, if we save this, let's see if it works. Now, I know it's the first time around, so we've probably messed something up, but let's check it out. I refresh, and everything works. We're not getting any errors, but remember, we actually need to connect it to our app. If we go back, we can now go to app.js, and we have all these props that we can use now. So the component did mount no longer needs to have the fetch call. All it needs is this.props dot and the action that we have on request robots. On request robots. Perfect. And we also don't need the constructor anymore, do we? Because there's no more states. These robots are now going to be returned as part of the props from on request robots. So again, we're going to change this.state to robots. And we can also get is pending to check if is pending is true, to render. If this is true, then we want to render loading. If not, we want to just render our RoboFriends. So those are coming from our props. And now we only have component did mount in our app. Let's save and go back to our app. All right, look at that. That doesn't happen very often, but I somehow managed to code without making any errors. Again, that's a rarity. Enjoy this moment. I'm definitely enjoying it. We see over here that we have request robots pending being fired, and then success being fired again. Let's refresh quickly. All right, what happens if the request fails? Let's go back here and go to our action.js, and let's just type something wrong here. We'll say like that, save it, go back, and there you go. We have request robots failed. Very cool. Let's fix that and save. All right, we have our app that does the exact same thing as before. Nothing too crazy, just filtering our robots. But the only difference is that we have this amazing logging ability, and it's using Redux. Very cool. I want to go over this one more time. And this is because it is a bit of a sticking point for most people. Remember this request robots, how it has this two functions? The request robot, right now, Redux out of the box, wouldn't understand this because we're not returning an object as it expects for an action. We're returning a function. And this function isn't going to mean anything to it. By adding Redux Thunk middleware, we're now listening to actions. And anytime the request robots action gets triggered, it's going to return a function and trigger Redux Thunk. And Redux Thunk is going to say, oh, this is a function. I'm going to give you, here's the dispatch so you can actually call some actions. And we can finally run our actions like this. So if we go back to our diagram, we've created a system where the actions are being triggered. They go through any middleware. If it's a search term change, it's just going to go straight to the reducer, run through a nice function, update the store, and make changes to our view. If we request robots, it's going to notice that it's a function. It's going to go into the middleware, and Redux Thunk is going to say, all right, first just dispatch pending to the reducer, and I'll let you know when I'm done with the promise, and I'll let you know if I got any robots. And when it returns, it's going to dispatch the success, go through the reducer, update the store, and make changes. Whew, that was a lot. But if you got this far and you understand it, you've pretty much gotten Redux. That's it. That's the whole Redux library. It's very, very simple. And once you start using it a couple of times and you get comfortable with it, it's really, really beautiful the way everything works. But for now, let's all take a break. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.